Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in flashbang grenades, drag you out in handcuffs, and hold your wife at gunpoint, all because they raided and went to the wrong house. Now here's the kicker: when you tried to hold the government accountable for that mistake, the government argues and claims that you can't sue them because their agents had discretion in how they planned and operated that raid. This exact situation went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the court handed down a 9-0 unanimous decision that could have big implications for everyone in the country. And now the 11th Circuit just reheard arguments in this case in light of what the Supreme Court said in that 9-0 order. So this is very interesting what developed during these arguments, so let's break down what just happened. Now before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also click the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. So if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of a family called the Martins. Now, the Martins were essentially victims of an FBI wrong house raid that was operated by the FBI in a suburban Atlanta area, and this raid happened back in 2017. Essentially, back in 2017, the FBI agents executed that pre-dawn raid against the family, and instead of going, there directly, the officers used his own personal GPS device. So he put the address in, which was on the warrant, into the GPS, and his GPS routed him what he claims to be the wrong home. So he claims that it pinged the wrong address. The GPS took him to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend and their 7-year-old son at the time. Now, when the FBI agents arrived at the home, without warning, they smashed in the front door, detonated flashbang grenades inside the house. They pulled the individuals out of the closet where they were hiding with a shotgun. They handcuffed the family, pulled Katrina Martin out. She was essentially half dressed, held her at gunpoint, and then also pulled out the kid. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they were kind of searching the home. And while performing that search, one of the agents noticed that there was some mail on a coffee table, and he noticed that it was the wrong address. That's when they kind of had this huge oh crap moment. We'd raided the wrong home. The officers then left the home, told the family that they would be back soon to explain, and the officers went about 3 homes down, which was actually separated by a cross street. So actually, it was on the other block across the street, and then they executed the raid against the correct home. Now, in response to this incident, the family sued the government and the FBI. They brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The government claimed immunity under the discretionary function exception and essentially asserted that this case must be thrown out and that they could not be sued. So on review, the lower courts originally sided with the FBI, but this made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed to step in, and essentially they disagreed with what the lower court said about this discretionary function exception. The Supreme Court made something very clear. They stated that you don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. The government has to show that those decisions were grounded in actual policy considerations, not just mistakes. And because of this, the Supreme Court sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit to apply the correct standard. And now the 11th Circuit just heard oral arguments in this case once again based on what the Supreme Court said, and that happened this week. And this is where things get very interesting. The judges during the arguments focused heavily on one key issue. Where is the line between policy discretion and basic operational failures? Now, throughout the argument, several judges pressed the government on this exact point. One of the big questions was essentially, how can executing a warrant at the wrong address possibly be considered a protected policy decision? The judges seemed very skeptical that something so fundamental like simply identifying the correct house based on a warrant could fall under the discretionary function exception and give the FBI immunity. There were also a lot of questions about whether the government's theory would go too far. So in other words, if this counts as discretion, then what wouldn't? Because under the DOJ's argument, almost any mistake during a law enforcement operation could be reframed as a discretionary judgment. As one judge actually put it during the arguments, almost everything involves a person's choice or judgment, and if the government's line is followed, if their rationale is followed, then everything would be covered under this exception. And that raised serious concerns with this panel here hearing these arguments. Another key line of questioning focused on the Supreme Court's recent ruling. The judges repeatedly pushed the government to explain how their position was consistent with what the Supreme Court just said in that unanimous ruling. And the government actually very much struggled to, give a clear answer about how their current position is in alignment with what the Supreme Court just said. The DOJ essentially doubled down on its arguments that they had already made. They claimed that everything leading up to the raid, including the surveillance, navigation, and execution, involved discretionary decisions. And because they claimed no specific rule actually dictated exactly how agents had to verify the address, they argued that the discretionary function exception still applies to the situation. But I will state it seemed like at least one or two of the judges here on the panel did not seem fully convinced by that argument. There was a lot of pushback about, maybe how you execute a warrant is discretionary. You can make decisions about how you want to execute a warrant, but getting the correct address on the warrant and going to the correct home is not a policy judgment. It's not judgment. You don't get to make a decision about going to the incorrect home. If you have a warrant, you have to go to the address on that warrant to execute it. You don't get to just go to any address or any home that you want. Now, on the other side, the plaintiffs made a much simpler argument. They told the court that this isn't about policy. This is about a basic non-discretionary duty. You have to hit the right house on a warrant. That's not a judgment call. That's the bare minimum requirement when you're executing a warrant. And that argument appeared to resonate very clearly with the panel, and it seemed like at least one of the two of the judges were actually on the plaintiff's side. So the biggest takeaway from these arguments is that it seemed like the judges were very concerned about the consequences of the government's current position. Because if the DOJ wins here, it would effectively mean that the wrong house raids, at question in this case and other issues, are almost always immune from lawsuits. And that would be dramatically expanding upon government immunity and would go far beyond what the Supreme Court has allowed in cases like this one. So what does this suggest about where the case is potentially heading? Well, based on the tone of the arguments, there are a couple likely paths. Most likely the outcome is that the 11th Circuit rules against the government and allows the Martin's family's case to move forward. There's also a possibility that the court will issue a narrow ruling, one that doesn't completely define the limits of this exception here in the FTCA, but makes clear that this specific error of getting the wrong house on a warrant is not protected. Now, there were also some discussions at the end of the arguments about one of the judges saying, well, do you want to do a new full briefing here in front of us, the 11th Circuit, because you said you don't want to take this down to the district court? Would you be open to doing a full new line of briefing based on what the Supreme Court just said, based on the fact that the district court, didn't review this new precedent by the Supreme Court? Would you be open to doing full new briefs? Both sides said, yes, we'd be open to that if the court wanted to, but we think that you can actually rule on this issue right here and now and that we don't need those briefs. So the court said that if they want additional briefs, they will notify the parties within the next week or so. So we'll also be keeping an eye out for that to see if the 11th Circuit wants to temporarily kind of punt this issue, get full briefs on the merits. And that also potentially signals that they will reach eventually the merits of this case. So this case is now at a critical point. We've had a unanimous Supreme Court ruling on this issue, and now we've had new arguments in front of the 11th Circuit. And based on those arguments, there are real signs that the court here may reject the government's attempt to avoid liability based on this FBI wrong house raid. So that's what's currently happening in this major accountability case dealing with the FBI and wrong house raids. As soon as we get more information or that decision from the 11th Circuit, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.